Tashley, welcome to the class. We are in the 11th class, even though we had a little rough road in between there at times. And so first, let's begin with taking a deep breath and then let it go out slowly. Just calming your mind and body into a sense of deep peace. And then, excuse me, a short refuge prayer. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, excuse me. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent for the benefit of all sentient beings. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent for the benefit of all sentient beings. I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent for the benefit of all sentient beings. So we have been talking about, last week we were talking about the common approach to the Tantra, and now we're moving on to the uncommon preliminaries. The common ones were the four thoughts that turn the mind: impermanence and death, recognizing those, everything is impermanent, we all die at some point. Karma and various actions associated with that, what we do, don't do, and so forth. And then the potential for reincarnation, according to the Buddhist tradition. If we engage in wrathful or difficult or harmful kinds of things, then we may wind up having to be reborn and go through all of these kinds of sufferings again. And then also impermanence. Everything is impermanent. It doesn't stay one particular way. So the Buddha said there can't be a soul because the soul is said to be permanent. But there is this precious human life, and this is really the most important element of what he is talking about, that we have this opportunity. There is a way out from all of these things. Whether you agree with all of them or not becomes irrelevant in terms of the practice, but that we also are committed to making a following of all of these things. And so now we move into chapter 12 in the book, the second training on meditation and the uncommon preliminaries. So it's always good to start out and go through just briefly those first four, but now we continue on. So the traditional tantric path includes preliminary practices that are designed to establish your commitment and discipline in the practice. So the uncommon preliminaries are refuge, bodhicitta, Vajrasattva purification, mandala offerings, and guru yoga. So there's those five. The first two are often done together. And so then each of these preliminary practices is traditionally repeated 100,000 times. Yes, that's 100,000 times as a preliminary to entering into tantric Buddhist training. So many Western students react to this rather negatively. Are you serious? I have to do this 100,000 times, each one of those five 100,000 times. So keep in mind that this serves a dual purpose. One is actual preparation for the advanced practices. The other is the evidence that you are, in fact, serious. I think that that's an important aspect of that. If you're not serious, then it becomes a burden. If you are serious, it doesn't matter. It actually becomes a fairly pleasant kind of practice. In reality, the exact number and sequence is in different combinations according to the particular school of Buddhism, according to the particular teacher. So there's a lot of variation as a part of that. So some of my teachers required the full 100,000 repetitions, which I did. And they do that for each of their students. Another teacher that I had required daily practice for 1 year, which I also did. And then still another teacher required it only daily as preliminary practice to other meditation practices. So as an ongoing thing, you don't ever complete it. You just continue that. I follow that as my standard these days as well. So I'm committed to those, and I think they're very important as a part of that. You'll have to make your own choices about those, but if you're going to follow me as your teacher, then we're going to expect at least a certain degree of participation. We'll go into that in a little bit more here momentarily. These practices are normally done by ordained monks and nuns in the first part of their 3-year retreat. So they go through a long period of development and training and so forth. They learn about these things, and then when they go into this 3-year retreat, which relatively few actually do, the first part of that, as I understand it, is typically committed to completing all of those 100,000 sets of practices. And it takes them about 6 to 9 months as a part of that. But this is a daunting challenge for most of lay practitioners in the West. So at only 10 per day, if you just say you did each one of these things, 10 per day, that cuts into more of that realistic 3 years. And so even that can be a time challenge depending on the exact text and ritual elements required by the teacher. At the same time, 3 years can seem like an eternity to someone who's anxious to proceed to more advanced practices. We see a lot of that as well. In addition to the approach mentioned above, based on the number of repetitions, there are 2 commitment alternatives. First one is based on time, and the second one based on the signs of accomplishment, if you will. And not all teachers require this. As the common preliminary practices, Pabhasambhava seems to have recommended a period of at least 3 days for each of these. So 3 days for each of them, that's not that bad, as long as you got full days in order to do that. So that's full time, and you would complete roughly 30 hours at 10 hours per day, just to give a general sense of that. What does that mean for us? So that would be 12 sessions in a formal retreat is often divided into 4 sessions each day. So we look at that and we break it into that kind of a context. And then since you are most likely not doing them full time, I recommend doing each of them for 1 week, twice each day, as we've talked about before with other practices, for a period of 3 weeks, once each day. So normally I recommend do it twice each day for a period of 1 week. And then assuming half an hour each session, that would be 7 hours of each, 14 sessions. And the first case, or over 10 hours or 21 sessions in the second case. So while this results in fewer hours of practice, it results in more sessions. And that's important. Research shows that the brain learns better from the number of sessions than the number of hours. So either of the 1 or 3 week formats of quality short sessions should have the same or even better effect on training the mind than 3-day formats suggested by Pabhasambhava. So that's important, I think, to doing these practices. When there's information that we have from science that conflicts somewhat or enhances somewhat what we have from the tradition, then I think we need to take advantage of that when we can. So more sessions can actually even be better. So we're not saying cut them out and don't do them. So following this pattern, I also recommend that following 1 or the 3 weeks model for each, lay practitioners should continue with a short preliminary practice prior to their daily practice for each for the rest of your life. Okay? And that's not hard to do. We'll look at that and different ways of doing it after we move through this. But that's what I do, a short version of this every day before I go into my other, the other parts of my practice. And so, of course, you can and will. Completing 100,000 of each of these is even better. Some teachers will not accept practitioners into the higher teachings without having completed these practices, so you need to be aware of that. However, in the Western tradition, this is less often followed. In any case, follow the instructions of your own lama. That's important. Whoever that you're using as your own lama, you need to follow whatever it is that they do. Here's one other example based on this. Refuge prayer with prostrations, 360 hours. It's a lot. The bodhicitta practices, also 360 hours. Vajrasattva practice with mantras, also 360 hours. The mandala offerings, 360 hours. And the guru yoga mantras, also 360 hours. So those are the kind of thing that sometimes are set up in terms of time rather than number of repetitions of those things. But those are a lot of hours, obviously. So it's important to ask your lama to how they think that you should do it. Now, in a third alternative, some lamas look for signs of accomplishment, which improve the degree of commitment to the practitioner. So that's what they're really looking for as opposed to accomplishing a specific number. And so these are dependent upon the lama. So contact them directly for this approach. They are some of the examples of signs at the end of this chapter of different ways of doing that. So they look for specific indicators or signs that you have actually accomplished that. Now, one of my students has a lama that just keeps telling him over and over, go more, 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 more. And so he kind of expresses all of that to me, and I say, calm down, keep down, do what you can do, and so forth. But he is making good progress. In addition, some lamas require that practices are done daily as a preliminary to other daily meditations for the rest of your life. That's kind of the approach that I have taken, and I think is a helpful one to follow because it's a reminder of some of the core principles. And so following an initial period, for example, 6 months, one of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind, one each for 5 uncommon preliminary practices. So there are abbreviated daily preliminary practices that are available for that purpose. We'll look at some of those as I mentioned before. There is one other recommendation to enhance training the mind, and that is keeping a daily journal. I think that is helpful. You don't have to write a book, but just keep a representation or notes about what practices that you have done. If you're doing it based on counting, then keep that counting as a part of that, and that will strengthen the effect of those practices because you're writing them down. It becomes a reminder and a motivation to continue with that. So just a few notes. And then each week and month, just go back and review what you've done and the experiences that you have had as a part of that. So it becomes a reminder as you build these up. And then it also will help give you a sense of commitment as you progress through these. So do not expect miracles. This is a slow process, just like learning to play the piano. It takes patience and persistence above all. And the rewards are nothing short of amazing, in my experience. So diligence or joyful effort does pay off as a part of this. And it can take less than some texts would have you believe. On the other hand, if you feel that you have not done well in the suggested framework, I recommend that you stick with that practice a bit longer until you feel you've really been successful as a part of that. So you need to feel confident that you have done that. And if you're working with a lama, which is always recommended, then also getting their support and their approval of that is very important. So one word of caution, I've also seen students who have so much doubt about their progress that they also allow themselves to get stuck. Okay, so they just are at that one level and they should be pushing forward to a higher level. So there is a need to balance that. Only you will know where you are. And talking with your lama can be helpful about, okay, go ahead, it's time for you to move on. Of course, having a master available for consultation is also extremely beneficial and highly preferable if you can. So now let's take a look at the first one of these, the refuge. And so the refuge vow is typically what we are using as a part of this. And so this is the first initiation, if you will, into the practice. And when it's conducted by a master, it takes the form of a simple ceremony. And that includes some explanation, the vow itself, an initiation, and giving a Tibetan name oftentimes, usually in my experience, but not always. My Tibetan name, I actually have two because I went through it 2 times, once with 2 different lamas each. And so Drime, which means stainless, and Dawa, which means moon. So my current lama has said, well, yeah, put those together, stainless moon. That's a great combination. So the refuge practice includes visualization, taking refuge, and then doing prostrations. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the prostrations because that can be an issue sometimes. The visualization is a refuge tree. I don't know if I can, I'm going to turn this a little bit and we'll see if you can see our refuge tree here. Excuse me. But over here, there's the refuge tree. Okay. So refuge trees vary somewhat from one lineage to another, and even branches within lineages and so forth about that. And so the ceremony associated with this includes some explanation, the vow, the initiation, and giving the name, as I mentioned. And so the refuge practice includes visualization, taking the refuge, and then doing prostrations as a part of that. So the visualization of the refuge tree that we looked at, that there are numerous variations of that and countless images that can be found on the internet. And so if you don't have one already, I recommend that you find one. You can print out a copy of that, have it available, which can be very helpful. Some people are very visually oriented, and it's easy for them to get an idea of what the details are and recognize it as opposed to a different one and so forth. Other people struggle a little bit with that. So in general, they follow this design. Guru Rinpoche in the center, but the Guru Rinpoche is associated with the Nyingma lineage, and so that is one of the core characteristics here. So it may, in a different lineage, have a different key figure. And then Buddhas are on Rinpoche's right. The Dharma texts are behind. They look a little bit like you're looking at a building that are sitting behind him, but they're actually a stack of the Dharma texts that are part of that. And then the primordial Buddha is at the top. And the primordial Buddha can be one or another figure, depending again on the lineage as a part of that. Samattabhadra would be ours, usually depicted with Samattabhadri. And then the Dharma protectors are below that, and then surrounded by dakas and dakinis of various forms. In addition, you visualize all sentient beings are in front of you. That's not part of the picture, the image, but you do that. And your mother and father are beside you. Enemies are in the front. That's important because we need to recognize that we're treating even our enemies with respect in various ways. And then all prostrate together while reciting the refuge prayer. So that's the basic ritual that is involved here. So you memorize and imagine this image while reciting the refuge prayer and make prostrations, the basic formula. Until then, it may be helpful to print a refuge, like I was mentioning. You can easy to print a copy off of the internet, or if you have a book that has a copy. And then since Padmasambhava represents the Nyingma lineage, I recommend something from that lineage, unless you are part of another lineage, which is fine. In that case, use their lineage tree. In the Buddhist tradition, you may take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the teacher, teachings, and the community. So refuge is a place that you go for support, for inspiration along the path. There are multiple levels of understanding as well. Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha are considered to be the outer level of a refuge. The inner level includes the guru, the yidam, and the dakini, although in some cases, instead of the dakini, it's a protector. In some cases, instead of 3, it's 4, so it has both the dakini and the protector. So then the guru is the teacher, the yidam is the personal yidam, and then selected for advanced meditation practices with guidance of your spiritual master or guru. And the dakini, or sky dancer, is a common translation of that, represents the feminine principle, which is wisdom. And so we will explore the dakini more later in the text. The secret level of refuge is the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. Kaya literally means body. And so these are 3 forms of a Buddha. Literally the truth body, which is the Dharmakaya, the enjoyment body, the Sambhogakaya. There's different ways of explaining that. And then the form body, respectively, which is the Nirmanakaya. So more specifically, they refer to transcendent wisdom, or the energy or cosmic form, if you will, and the radiant display of material manifestation. So these correspond closely to Christian Trinity's Father, Holy Ghost, and Son. A lot of lamas, particularly teaching in the West, mention that comparison. So another analogy is water. Water as ice, liquid, and steam. So it's all still water, but it has different forms. So these 3 kayas, or 3 bodies, are all the same thing, but they have different forms. And so all other forms of water appearing in different qualities, fundamentally, the Buddha is within. Okay, Buddha nature, we talked about before. We just need to wake up to that fact, understand its true nature, and live within that reality in our daily lives. We already are Buddhas, so that's an important thing, to think of ourselves as Buddhas and then act as if we are Buddhas to the best of our ability. So taking refuge at the secret level acknowledges this understanding. And then while taking refuge, it is customary to make the prostrations that I mentioned. Prostrations are the tradition of reverence for the Buddha, the Guru, or other significant figure. We began by placing our hands together with the palms slightly cupped like this. So not the flat one like this that we see is a part of the Indian culture, which is also good, but that's not what we do. We do it this way. So there's an opening within the palms of the hand. Got people that can't see hiding there. Okay, so back to my notes here. So we're placing those together, slightly cupped, as I mentioned, which is symbolic of the lotus bud. Okay, so that's what that represents. The hands are raised overhead, touching the crown, saying, I take refuge. Then touch the third eye, which is located here, on the forehead, saying in the Buddha, and then touching the throat, we say in the Dharma, and then touching the heart in the Sangha. So that's a customary way to do that. The exact wording may vary, though, from one text to another, and some versions start at the crown, so taking refuge at the top here rather than taking refuge at the center of the forehead. And then in that case, they do it up here, then they would skip the forehead and then go to the throat and then to the heart. So we make the prostration then by bending down on the hands and knees and then sliding the hands forward until you are prone on the ground with hands, feet, and forehead touching the ground. So as we do that, we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and get down on hands and knees, and then spread out. And it's okay if you have some kind of a padding or something to do this on. The hard floors can be a little bit hard to do this on. And so we do that, and then we come back up. So we complete the remaining part of the prayer in the process of standing up. After repeating the prostrations, we conclude by folding the hands to the heart. So after we get back up, we bring the hands back to the heart. And then an abbreviated version touches the forehead to the ground with the hands in the hands and knees position. So if we don't lay all the way out, and some people that's really difficult to do, you just get on your hands and knees, touch your forehead to the ground, and then come back up. Okay, so that's a shorter version that can be done as a part of this. And if you're unable to physically do prostrations at all, then you might just imagine them and then just bow. You hold your hand here. You can do that with your hands and then just bow down. So any of those are acceptable to me. If you have a different lama, you may want to talk with them about that. Another thing that sometimes happens is that even if you're able to do a full body length prostration, you may not be able to do a lot of them. You may only be able to do a few of them, and then maybe you can go to one of these other methods that cut back on that a little bit for your physical body. So if you are counting, it is helpful to use a counter, such as those that we see at athletic events. And I thought I had one here. I'm not sure where it went. But the little clickers that they hold in their hands for each person that goes by, different events use that. And those come in very handy for doing this kind of thing, so you don't have to remember how many of them that you have done. And so you don't have to keep track of them. And you just click off as many as you have, and then you start off at the same place the next day, and so forth. And you only then have to write it down once the whole clicker gets full. And then you say, okay, one whole clicker full. And then you starts over automatically. And so these are also normally repeated 3 times upon entering the temple. So once you walk in and bow down and take refuge, and then entering into and seating when the master comes in. So if you're there, then the master walks in, then typically we bow down to them. And then when they sit down, typically on the throne, then we also then bow down and do the full prostrations to them. Now, in most cases, in my experience here in the West, these are too crowded for people to actually do that. There may be space for one or two people on the sides or in between rows or something like that. But oftentimes they simply said, no, sit down, just sit down. Okay, and so do that. Or you can do the bow down thing. And most people are able to do that. There's enough of that room around being able to do that. And so we're repeating this thing as a part of taking refuge. Note that refuge is often combined with bodhicitta. So for practice, we're going to, in this text, we're going to combine those two. So the refuge part we've talked about, and that's an important tradition to just recognize the importance of the tradition to you. The symbolic representation of the masters, the teachers, the sangha, all of those different things as a part of that. So now we go on to bodhicitta. Now, this is one of the few Sanskrit words that I chose to retain due to its special meaning for me personally. It has different meanings in different teachers and teachings, which can be a source of confusion for practitioners, sometimes reading different sources. It's described in the path of altruism, and so this is usually translated as the mind of liberation. Okay, bodhicitta, the mind of liberation. So to review, it has two parts. The first is one which is subdivided into two aspects, making a total of three parts. So the first part is relative bodhicitta. And then the first aspect of that is relative bodhicitta as altruistic intention. So our intention is very important. So that's the first of the three. The intention to achieve liberation. So the core of what the Buddha taught was we live in the world of samsara, which involves all kinds of suffering. And so we want to achieve liberation from that. And so that's what this is, our altruistic intention to do that. But when we talk about it as altruistic in the Bodhisattva view, that means not only for us, but it means for all beings. And so then the intention to achieve liberation for the benefit of all others, or even delaying our final liberation for ourselves until all beings have also achieved enlightenment. So altruistic motivation is a very high level of motivation that few in the West ever fully attain. So a lot of people just are not that committed. Generally speaking, people in the East seem to be more committed, although I think that is changing now with the changes in culture and the influence of the West in the East and so forth. So now, the second aspect of the relative bodhicitta is called action bodhicitta. So the first one is that relative bodhicitta and now action bodhicitta. In this case, bodhicitta is equivalent to loving kindness and compassion. So loving kindness and compassion are two aspects of the same thing. Loving kindness refers to the desire for others to achieve happiness and the causes of happiness. And then compassion is the desire for others to avoid unhappiness or suffering and the causes of those unhappiness. In other words, we want them to all have the good and don't have the bad. It's a simple way to put it. But loving kindness and compassion, basically the same meaning, but with that difference between them. So these forms of desire are okay. We sometimes say, well, You don't want desire, but in fact, some kinds of desire are good. Wanting to become a Buddha, wanting to achieve liberation, those are good things. Wanting all beings to achieve liberation, those are good things. So we don't want to push the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So action bodhicitta is also tied to the bodhisattva vow, previously described. We talked about that earlier in this class. This deals with the application of the principle of bodhicitta in our daily behaviors, especially those involving others. And so the second part of this is the bodhicitta is ultimate bodhicitta. So we had two variations of the relative, and so now we go to the ultimate. This is the suchness or emptiness of transcendent wisdom described previously. Relative and ultimate bodhicitta are non-dual, two aspects of the same truth, sometimes like the front and the back of your hand. Okay? So it's one, but it does have different characteristics as a part of that. So loving kindness and compassion are two of the four immeasurables. So these are immeasurable because there is no limit to their realization and application. The third one then is joy. So we have loving kindness, compassion, and the third one is joy, or more specifically, sympathetic joy. At an ordinary level, this is the joy we express toward the happiness realized by others. So you're happy, your practice is going really well, you won the lottery, whatever it happens to be, we look at that as the happiness somebody else is having. And we're pleased about their happiness, even if it's at that relative level. So rather than feeling envy or jealousy, we are deeply happy for their happiness. As described previously, our focus is on the benefits for others over interest, self-interest, or ego. At a higher level, this is the joy related to liberation. We wish all sentient beings experience this form of joy. The fourth immeasurable is equanimity. And equanimity has two different meanings, generally speaking. So equanimity refers in one case to equality, treating everyone and every phenomena in the same way. But it also means mental calm. And that actually is the way that it is more commonly used. And so, as it is often used in other practices, and so everyone is treated with loving kindness, compassion, and joy, whether they are friends or family or even our enemies. It's a very difficult standard for most of us to achieve. The things that are going on politically right now in our country, that can be a big challenge. It is the same standard that Jesus called his followers to practice, that is to love not only God or each other, others on the path, if you will, and our neighbors, literally other countries, but also our enemies. So this is a parallel between those. Previously, we did the short prayer of the four immeasurables that is often recited and a part of the daily preliminary practice. In some traditions, the refuge and bodhicitta are combined into one practice, a single practice. And so this is what we are going to do in this case. In others, they're done separately, including the additional 100,000 repetitions, but here you get to count them for both at the same time. You only count them once, but you're including them in together as they're separate elements of the practice, and so they're both covered. For lay practitioners, I recommend that you do as many repetitions of refuge prayers and prostrations followed by the bodhicitta prayer as you can during your 2 daily sessions for 1 week, or one daily session for 3 weeks. But we're pretty much following the idea as we're meeting week by week as we go through this process of doing them over a period of 1 week, 2 times each day, half an hour each of those. You can do more, you can break them into more parts, whatever works. So this is practice number 17 in the course. And so it has the same initial parts, which are contemplating these for that time period that I just mentioned, and then reciting your intention, either the one that is a part of this, or you can also look at it in terms of your own idea about what it is that you want how you want that to work. So imagine then the refuge tree. Got a temporary flash there on my screen. So we go for the outer, inner, and secret refuge with prostrations. So I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha most excellent. I take refuge in the Guru, Yidam, and Dakini. And then generating bodhicitta, the 4 immeasurables. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be liberated from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the happiness that is free from sorrow. And may they rest in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. We use that in our practice as a Sangha regularly. And so then you repeat that as many times as you can. So that's what we're counting, is those 2 sets of those. And then once you've said, okay, this is the end here, I'm at the end of my half an hour, I've got to go do other things, you recite, by the merit of this practice, may I attain liberation for the benefit of all sentient beings, 3 times. And then for post-meditation, you arise gently. This isn't something that we just jump up with. We're trying to sustain what we've created during meditation. So then leading your life in a meditative fashion is one of the ways that that is described. And so that is what we are talking about here for today. And we've got a little bit of time left. So I wanted to insert something that is in one of the appendices as a part of this class, which has to do with pronunciation. If you're not really familiar with these words in Tibetan or Sanskrit and so forth, it can be kind of difficult to figure out, and it's often pretty obvious sometimes when somebody has learned about this simply from reading books, because they mispronounce a lot of things. But there's also multiple ways of pronouncing these things, because Tibet's a big country and people have different ways of pronouncing things, just like going from, say, LA to someplace in the South and someplace up in New York City and so forth. The pronunciations change, and in some cases, even the words themselves to some degree. Okay, so this is a part of Appendix B in the book. So we're going to look at these for transliterations in terms of the English script. There are numerous Tibetan dialects, as I mentioned, and so those can become complicated. So Tibetan script is based on syllables rather than letters. So that's one of the first things to recognize. The alphabet is based on syllables, not individual letters. Okay? So it is common for the practice to include this Tibetan script as a transliteration and an English translation. So the translation is an approximate pronunciation of the Tibetan script. However, there are a variety of dialects, as I was just mentioning. So not all of them are pronounced the same way. We'll talk a little bit about that here. And then some are quite different. So there is no standard for translation. I once asked a translator who was giving us a little teaching on some of this. And I said, well, how do I know? I can't remember what the words were, but some people pronounce it this way, some people pronounce it that way. How do I know which is the right way to do it? She said, just pronounce it the way your teacher does. And so that can change. You get two different teachers, they may pronounce it different. Just do it following that. So there are some that are more phonetic than others. So furthermore, some try to capture subtle nuances within the Tibetan pronunciation, while others use a more Western kind of approach to pronunciation. So this short guide will assist you with helping on some of the most basic ways to pronounce Tibetan syllables during your practice. So we're going to go through some examples that I have set up in the appendix here. So the syllables. So the first thing to notice in looking at the translation or transliteration is to know how to divide words into syllables. So the most syllables end with a vowel in Tibetan, but not always. So look for vowels to potentially divide at different points of a word. And so I started off with this case with a mantra, Om Benzasato Samaya Manapalaya Benzasato Tenopa Tishtadrido Me Bhava, one that we commonly use in our practice. So where are the divisions in terms of syllables? So Om, one syllable, and then Benza, two, okay? Then Sato, Samaya, three in that case. And then Manu, Palaya, Benza, Sato, Tenopa, Tishta, Drito, Me, Bhava. Okay, so that's what you have to do, is look for where those divisions are as a part of that. Now there's some guides to help figure out where that is. And so this is the opening part of the Vajrasattva mantra. And so you can see the divisions with a few exceptions. There are two or more consonants together. So when you see that in a word, two consonants, then that's probably the division point. One or two are likely to be attached after a prior vowel. And so it happens above with benza. And so we see the Z, ben, za, two consonants, division is there. And then we have tishta. Okay, so we have an SH, T. So we have three consonants there. So where's the division? It could be one place or the other. And so tish oftentimes goes together. If there's an H, it oftentimes is linked to the prior consonant. So tishta, which can change the pronunciation of the vowel, often in a more Western kind of a way. So then I have vowels. There are 5 main vowels in both English and in Tibetan. So in English, we have A, E, I, O, U. In Tibetan, we have rough equivalents of that as A, I, A, E, and 2 E. I'm gonna put these in spellings in a way. So A, A-H, A, A-Y, E, 2 E's, O, O-H, and U, O-O, okay? So that's kind of a Tibetan transliteration of that. And so then I give you some examples here to try and work with. So dewa, one of the words that we looked at there. And so dewa, D-E-W-A, so dewa, simple. Lama, so lama, again, real simple. And then we have gate, pretty simple, gate. And then Pei-mei. Now that Pei-mei could be pronounced Pei-mei, Pei-ma. Different people pronounce it in slightly different ways, but again, it's basically a two-syllable word. You just divide in the middle. And then we have dakini. Okay, that's a little more complicated. And so we've got three syllables as a part of it. Dakini or dakini. Again, there's a little different pronunciation options there. But it's pretty straightforward. Have a consonant and a vowel in each of the three. And then hri. Three syllables, single consonant, single vowel. And so hri, the H and the R get mixed, blended together, and then the E. But in some cases, this one is actually pronounced as Shri. So an S is put in there in terms of the way that it is pronounced. So you might hear it either of those ways. And then the O, we have to treng. And so that one is two syllables, to treng. And so it can be divided with the to, but treng is 5 letters. And it includes 4 consonants. So that gets a little bit more complicated, but it gets pulled together because there's not another place to divide it with a separate vowel. And so then another example here with the O is Om, just O-M, so it's just straight, or Om with an H, so it's O. Oh, it's a soft O, if you will. And then the U, we have guru. Obvious one, 4 letters, consonant, vowel, just divide it, guru. And then hong, another one that we use a lot, 4 letters, H-U-N-G. And so the hong often goes together. And if we see a G at the end, a lot of times, and especially if it's an NG together, those are kind of pronounced as a singularity, so hung. So as shown, there are some exceptions that can only be learned through experience. And so that's part of it. It's just, they have the rules, the basic rules, but then there's also exceptions. So don't be concerned about mistakes. We all make them, even with considerable experience. So note too, that there are no accents to emphasize certain syllables over others as we do in the West. But in fact, we often do add accents in the West. And so the list above all would have an accent on the first syllable except the kini. And so where it is on the second syllable. Sanskrit pronunciations of these vary somewhat. So it may be pronounced as dakini. Okay, so the pronunciation may be a little, but in the West, it's usually dakini. Then consonants. How do we address these kind of things with consonants? Well, most consonants are the same as in English. Okay, but as in English, there are also differences in pronunciation. So for example, how you pronounce a G. Okay, in most cases, it's a hard G, G, or a soft G, J. But it can also be either. So here we have a word, organ or origin. And it can be pronounced either way, okay? More like a J or more like a G. But a G before another consonant is pronounced halfway in between a J, or G, excuse me, and a K, okay? So an example here, it's more like a stop than a pronunciation. So familiar with the word Dzogchen, okay? It starts with a DZ, which combine d, z, zo, and then the G is more like a g, a short g, or a K. So sometimes it's actually pronounced as Dzogchen. Okay, either way. Another factor is that D. The D generally is not considered a part of the pronunciation, but in English, we often just pronounce it as if it starts with the Z, the Dzogchen, but it starts with a preliminary, like you're going to say a D, and your tongue is touching your roof, and then Z, 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 Dzogchen. There are also unusual consonant combinations such as TS or DZ that start with the first letter but emphasize the second one. So Dzogchen above, where the D had been omitted. Another example is Dzogchen. Okay, Dzogchen being the consort of Padmasambhava. So Dzogchen is spelled with a TS, T-S-O-G-A-Y-L. And so it is sometimes pronounced as if that T doesn't exist, just Sogyal. But that T is combined together. So it's a Tsogyal. It's not Tsa. It's a combination of the Tsogyal. And then another variation is when the next syllable begins with a Y. Often it's shortened long EE, and sound is inserted, or it may be changed to a different vowel sound altogether. So the first example here is samye, another word we use quite a bit. So samaye or samaya, ya. Okay, so different variations there, and then tayata, okay, tayata. So here, it's sometimes pronounced as tayata or tayata. So to get these variations, it's not absolutely critical that you get them right, but I like to help give you some explanations that can be helpful to you as you're learning these things. So there may also be dangling silent consonants at the end of a word. So we have the word D-A-G. You would think it would be dog, not an O, but dog. But it's da, like there's an H at the end, so it's silent. And then the same effect, show, and just show. There's no end at the end. And then many transliterations use a silent H to soften the consonant, such as ta, so T-A-H effect. It's like T-H-A, but it's ta, or ba. And then a PH is a soft P, or not an F. Okay, for example, we have words that start with a PH, which we pronounce as if it's an F. Philosophy, okay, PH, but we pronounce it with an F. So we have a word in Tibetan Buddhism that's fairly common, Phat, P-H-A-T. But it's more like pay. It's certainly not fei, okay? So then another one is an A, is a V that's often pronounced as a W. But some get changed even more. So sarva or sarwa. And we see people doing it in both of those ways. So mantras are usually written in Sanskrit instead of Tibetan, but many Tibetans are not much better at pronouncing Sanskrit than we are in Tibetan, although I think that there's been more emphasis of it than in the last number of years, and so they're getting a little better at that. So there are quite a few words that are pronounced in ways having little to do with transliterations. And so we pronounce Vajrasattva, for example. So it could be Vajrasattva. okay, or Bodhisattva. But Vajrasattva works for us, but oftentimes it's Bodhisattva. And then Padma, Peme, sometimes, or Hri, either the Hri or the Shri that I mentioned before. Okay, so that gives you a little introduction to some of the pronunciation. It's a very complex kind of a language with lots of different variations, a lot like English. English is apparently one of the most difficult languages for people to learn from other countries. And so just keep that in mind. But hopefully that will be a little bit helpful for you. So that is wrapping up our class today as a part of that. And so we want to just a note for next week that we're going to move on to Vajrasattva, get the pronunciation right, Vajrasattva purification. So that is the next step in the Nindro practice. So do as many as you can of these other practices that we just went through this morning. And let me know if you have any questions or comments as a part of that. Meanwhile, please abide softly and deeply in pure awareness with loving kindness, compassion for all, always and always. Please also pray for peace. Thank you very much.